The American Yawp, Chapter 6, The American Revolution. Section 3, The Causes of the American Revolution. Most immediately, the American Revolution resulted directly from attempts to reform the British Empire after the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was the culmination of nearly a half-century of war between Europe's imperial powers. It was truly a world war, fought between multiple empires on multiple continents. At its conclusion, the victorious British Empire had never been larger. Britain now controlled the North American continent east of the Mississippi River, including French Canada. It had also consolidated its control over India. But the realities and responsibilities of the post-war empire were daunting. War, let alone victory, on such a scale was costly. Britain doubled the national debt to 13.5 times its annual revenue. It also faced significant new costs required to secure and defend its far-flung empire, especially the western frontiers of the North American colonies. These factors led Britain to attempt to consolidate control over its North American colonies, which, in turn, led to resistance. King George III took the crown in 1760 and brought Tories into his government after 3 decades of Whig rule. His new ministers represented the authoritarian vision of empire in which colonies would be subordinate. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was Britain's first major post-war imperial action targeting North America. The king forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to limit costly wars with Native Americans. Colonists, however, protested and demanded access to the territory for which they had fought alongside the British. In 1764, Parliament passed 2 more reforms. The Sugar Act sought to combat widespread smuggling of molasses in New England by cutting the duty in half but increasing enforcement. In addition, smugglers would be tried by vice admiralty courts and not juries. Parliament also passed the Currency Act, which restricted colonies from producing paper money. Hard money, such as gold and silver coins, was scarce in the colonies. The lack of currency impeded the colonies' increasingly sophisticated transatlantic economies, but it was especially damaging in 1764 because a post-war recession had already begun. Between the restrictions of the Proclamation of 1763, the Currency Act, and the Sugar Act's canceling of trials by jury for smugglers, some colonists began to fear a pattern of increased taxation and restricted liberties. In March 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The act required that many documents be printed on paper that had been stamped to show the duty had been paid, including newspapers, pamphlets, diplomas, legal documents, and even playing cards. The Sugar Act of 1764 was an attempt to get merchants to pay an already existing duty, but the Stamp Act created a new, direct, or internal tax. Parliament had never before directly taxed the colonists. Instead, colonies contributed to the empire through the payment of indirect, external taxes, such as customs duties. In 1765, Daniel Dulaney of Maryland wrote, "A right to impose an internal tax on the colonies, without their consent for the single purpose of revenue, is denied. A right to regulate their trade without their consent is admitted." Also, unlike the Sugar Act, which primarily affected merchants, the Stamp Act directly affected numerous groups throughout colonial society, including printers, lawyers, college graduates, and even sailors who played cards. This led, in part, to broader, more popular resistance. Resistance to the Stamp Act took 3 forms, distinguished largely by class: legislative resistance by elites, economic resistance by merchants, and popular protest by common colonists. Colonial elites responded by passing resolutions in their assemblies. The most famous of the anti-Stamp Act resolutions were the Virginia Resolves, passed by the House of Burgesses on May 30th, 1765, which declared that the colonists were entitled to all the liberties, privileges, franchises, and immunities possessed by the people of Great Britain. When the Virginia Resolves were printed throughout the colonies, however, they often included a few extra, far more radical resolutions not passed by the Virginia House of Burgesses, the last of which asserted that only the General Assembly of this colony have any right or power to impose or lay any taxation, and that anyone who argued differently shall be deemed an enemy to this His Majesty's colony. These additional resolves spread throughout the colonies and helped radicalize subsequent responses in other colonial assemblies. These responses led to the calling of the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in October 1765. 9 colonies sent delegates, who included Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, Thomas Hutchinson, Philip Livingston, and James Otis. The Stamp Act Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which, like the Virginia Resolves, declared allegiance to the king and all due subordination to Parliament, but also reasserted the idea that colonists were entitled to the same rights as Britons. Those rights included trial by jury, which had been abridged by the Sugar Act, and the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. As Daniel Dulaney wrote in 1765, it is an essential principle of the English Constitution that the subject shall not be taxed without his consent. Benjamin Franklin called it the prime maxim of all free government. Because the colonies did not elect members to Parliament, they believed that they were not represented and could not be taxed by that body. In response, Parliament and the Crown argued that the colonists were virtually represented, just like the residents of those boroughs or counties in England that did not elect members to Parliament. However, the colonists rejected the notion of virtual representation, with one pamphleteer calling it a monstrous idea. The second type of resistance to the Stamp Act was economic. While the Stamp Act Congress deliberated, merchants in major port cities were preparing non-importation agreements, hoping that their refusal to import British goods would lead British merchants to lobby for the repeal of the Stamp Act. In New York City, upwards of 200 principal merchants agreed not to import, sell, or buy any goods, wares, or merchandises from Great Britain. In Philadelphia, merchants gathered at, quote, a general meeting to agree that they would not import any goods from Great Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. The plan worked. By January 1766, London merchants sent a letter to Parliament, arguing that they had been, quote, reduced to the necessity of pending ruin by the Stamp Act and the subsequent boycotts. The third, and perhaps most crucial type of resistance, was popular protest. In August 1765, riots broke out in Boston. Crowds burned the appointed stamp distributor for Massachusetts, Andrew Oliver, in effigy and pulled a building he owned down to the ground in 5 minutes. Oliver resigned the position the next day. The following week, a crowd also set upon the home of his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who had publicly argued for submission to the stamp tax. Before the evening was over, much of Hutchinson's home and belongings had been destroyed. Popular violence and intimidation spread quickly throughout the colonies. In New York City, posted notices read, Piro Patria, the first man that either distributes or makes use of stamped paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects. Vox Populi. We dare. By November 16th, all of the original 12 stamp distributors had resigned, and by early 1766, groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty were formed in most colonies to direct and organize further resistance. These tactics had the dual effect of sending a message to Parliament and discouraging colonists from accepting appointments as stamp distributors. With no one willing to distribute the stamps, the act became unenforceable. Pressure on Parliament grew until, in February 1766, it repealed the Stamp Act. But to save face and to try to avoid this kind of problem in the future, Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that Parliament had the, quote, full power and authority to make laws, to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. However, colonists were too busy celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act to take much notice of the Declaratory Act. In New York City, the inhabitants raised a huge lead statue of King George III in honor of the Stamp Act's repeal. It could be argued that there was no moment at which colonists felt more proud to be members of the free British Empire than 1766. But Britain still needed revenue from the colonies. The colonies had resisted the implementation of direct taxes, but the Declaratory Act reserved Parliament's right to impose them. And, in the colonists' dispatches to Parliament and in numerous pamphlets, they had explicitly acknowledged the right of Parliament to regulate colonial trade. So Britain's next attempt to draw revenues from the colonies was aimed at taxing trade. Passed in June 1767, the Townshend Acts created new customs duties on common items, like lead, glass, paint, and tea, instead of direct taxes. They also created and strengthened formal mechanisms to enforce compliance, including a new American Board of Customs Commissioners and more Vice Admiralty courts to try smugglers. Revenues from seizures would be used to pay customs officers and other royal officials, including the governors, thereby incentivizing them to convict offenders. These acts increased the presence of the British government in the colonies and circumscribed the authority of the colonial assemblies, since paying the governor's salary had long given the assemblies significant power over them. Unsurprisingly, colonists once again resisted. Even though these were duties, many colonial resistance authors still referred to them as taxes, because they were designed primarily to extract revenues from the colonies, not to regulate trade. John Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, wrote that we may legally be bound to pay any general duties on these commodities relative to the regulation of trade is granted, but we, being obliged by her laws to take them from Great Britain, any special duties imposed on their exportation to us only, with intention to raise a revenue from us only, are as much taxes upon us as those imposed by the Stamp Act. Hence, many authors asked, once the colonists assented to a new tax in any form, what would stop the British from imposing ever more and greater taxes on the colonists? New forms of resistance emerged in which elite, middling, and working-class colonists participated together. Merchants reinstituted non-importation agreements, and common colonists agreed not to consume these same products. Lists were circulated with signatories promising not to buy any British goods. These lists were often published in newspapers, bestowing recognition on those who had signed and leading to pressure on those who had not. Women, too, became involved to an unprecedented degree in resistance to the Townshend Acts. They circulated subscription lists and gathered signatures. The first political commentaries in newspapers written by women appeared. Also, without new imports of British clothes, colonists took to wearing simple, homespun clothing. Spinning clubs were formed, in which local women would gather at one of their homes and spin cloth for homespun clothing for their families and even for the community. Homespun clothing quickly became a marker of one's virtue and patriotism, and women were an important part of this cultural shift. At the same time, British goods and luxuries previously desired now became symbols of tyranny. Non-importation and, especially, non-consumption agreements changed colonists' cultural relationship with the mother country. Committees of inspection monitored merchants and residents to make sure that no one broke the agreements. Offenders could expect to be shamed by having their names and offenses published in the newspaper and in broadsides. Non-importation and non-consumption helped forge colonial unity. Colonies formed committees of correspondence to keep each other informed of the resistance efforts throughout the colonies. Newspapers reprinted exploits of resistance, giving colonists a sense that they were part of a broader political community. The best example of this new continental conversation came in the wake of the Boston Massacre. Britain sent regiments to Boston in 1768 to help enforce the new acts and quell the resistance. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a crowd gathered outside the Custom House and began hurling insults, snowballs, and perhaps more at the young sentry. When a small number of soldiers came to the sentry's aid, the crowd grew increasingly hostile until the soldiers fired their muskets. After the smoke cleared, 5 Bostonians were dead, including one of the ringleaders, Crispus Attucks, a formerly enslaved mixed-race man turned free dock worker. The soldiers were tried in Boston and won acquittal, thanks in part to their defense attorney, John Adams. News of the Boston Massacre spread quickly through the new resistance communication networks, aided by a famous engraving initially circulated by Paul Revere, which depicted bloodthirsty British soldiers with grins on their faces firing into a peaceful crowd. The engraving was quickly circulated and reprinted throughout the colonies, generating sympathy for Boston and anger with Britain. Resistance again led to repeal. In March 1770, Parliament repealed all of the new duties except the one on tea, which, like the Declaratory Act, was left in part to save face and assert that Parliament still retained the right to tax the colonies. The character of colonial resistance had changed between 1765 and 1770. During the Stamp Act resistance, elites wrote resolves and held congresses, while violent popular mobs burned effigies and tore down houses, with minimal coordination between colonies. But methods of resistance against the Townshend Acts became more inclusive and more coordinated. Colonists previously excluded from meaningful political participation now gathered signatures, and colonists of all ranks participated in the resistance by not buying British goods and monitoring and enforcing the boycotts. Britain's failed attempts at imperial reform in the 1760s created an increasingly vigilant and resistant colonial population, and, most importantly, an enlarged political sphere, both on the colonial and continental levels, far beyond anything anyone could have imagined a few years earlier. A new sense of shared grievances began to join the colonists in a shared American political identity.